welcome you all to what I think is a really important topic and sort of one of the sort of I mean, not next generation exactly, but maybe the next step in the gender equality planning process for many of us, or I would certainly hope that would be the case. Um, so first of all, I want to thank our friends at Aggregate for sort of organizing us, organizing this series, generally taking charge of us as the sister projects. Very much appreciated. I think turning into a very valuable series of webinars. And of course, thank you all for joining us. Um, Let me make a disclaimer to start. This is quite a basic level, sort of beginner entrance to gender budgeting. And in part, it's that way because that's where we started. I mean, we knew that there was this idea of gender budgeting. We could guess what it was because we work on gender and gender equality plans, but we really didn't know what it was. So this is quite a basic introduction, and also what I hope is a practical sort of approach in the sense of what we want to share here today is what we did and what our approach was. Because, I mean, what we found is that the theory is great, but we didn't always know what to do with it. We didn't always know how to apply it to our situation. So I hope I can, maybe help overcome a little bit in that regard. Just a quick, as I like to say, a word from our sponsors. Um, Budgeted, as I'm sure most of you know, is a 3-year project specifically designed to use gender plus budgeting in addition to gender equality plans to transform institutions and to advance inclusive gender plus equality. We're a consortium of 5 universities and 4 municipalities, which is also sort of a different issue because municipalities are very different organizations from universities in terms of how they operate and how they budget. That was one of the things that we had to learn along the way. So I thought it would be helpful if we started maybe with a little background, a little bit a definitional work. Excuse me. If we look at the literature and the history of gender budgeting, 2 different ways that it is referred to, usually gender budgeting or gender responsive budgeting. These are essentially the same thing. They just have different organizations, different countries use different language, but they essentially refer to the same thing. I've used the definition and purpose here from the Council of Europe because we're all on EU projects, so that made a certain amount of sense. So the Council of Europe defines gender budgeting as gender-based assessment of budgets, incorporating a gender perspective at all levels of the budgetary process and restructuring. I think this is a really important part of the picture, restructuring revenues and expenditures in order to promote gender equality. Okay? So kind of a twofold thing. There's the analysis part, and then there's the part where we try to restructure the budget itself in a more equitable manner. And I'll come back to that issue a little bit later. So the purpose of gender budgeting is essentially threefold: to promote accountability and transparency in fiscal planning, to increase, gender responsive participation in the budget process. For example, by undertaking steps to involve women and men equally in budget preparation, and to advance gender equality and women's rights. So this is just a very small aside that came to my mind as I was reading this issue. So it's very interesting that at our university, for example, when we look at committees, the majority of committee work is actually done by women. We don't have an issue with inequality in terms of women, or I should say, women are not underrepresented on the vast majority of committees, with one exception, the Finance Committee. The Financing Budgeting Committee is controlled by men, which I think says a lot. So gender budgeting is, to be quite honest, not new. The first gender budget was put forth, or the first sort of official gender budgeting was undertaken by the government of Australia. And between 1989 and 1996, followed by the UK, Canada, South Africa, you may see a theme here, Commonwealth countries, initiated gender budgets. Gender budgeting was a part of the Beijing Platform for Action. This, I think, was very interesting. The platform stated that 20% of official development assistance and 20% of the national budget should go to basic social program that goes to basic social programs should take into account a gender perspective. So a sort of partial approach, if you will, or a beginning place. In 2015, the IMF has what's called the Gender Budgeting Indicator, and it includes 84 countries. So that's a pretty good number. And for those of us who are in the OECD, 23 OECD countries are using gender budgeting. This gives you an idea. You can probably, if it's large enough, you can find yourself. I think the notable thing is that the number of OECD countries engaged in gender budgeting has doubled since 2012. And according to their research, it has helped close 61% of gender gaps in OECD countries. So, I mean, gender budgeting certainly appears to be here. Many countries engaging in it, and at least according to the OECD data, it works. I mean, I think that's the really important. It's not an empty exercise. It really does work as long as we get to the part where we're actually restructuring the budget. Okay, so here's the more practical part. Where to start? What a great question. Well, and in some respects, this is one of the harder parts, to be quite honest. So the first part, of course, is a gendered analysis, or an analysis using a gender perspective of the existing budget. Now, this budget could be your institutional budget. It could be a faculty budget. I mean, I'm speaking most in terms of universities because most of us here today are at universities. But if you think about whatever your institution is, you could take the whole institution or you could take a smaller part of the institution. The important thing is to get the budget. Now, from our experience, that is not always an easy task. We are at a private university, so our institutional budget is not public. So that requires some official requests, some use of personal relationships to try to get the information on our part. So that's one issue to think about is, excuse me, can you get the budget? And of course, can you get the entire budget? Because the institution may be willing to give you part of the budget, but not the whole budget. So that was our case, okay? So that's the first issue is you need the budget, okay? Now, I think along with the budget, it's extremely important that we need the gender disaggregated data for our institution at the same time. And of course, if that is intersectional data, that's even better. I know that there are many difficulties collecting intersectional data, but to the extent that we can collect it, it's very important. But I don't think I can really emphasize enough that the gender analysis of the budget and the gender disaggregated data really need to go together. There are two parts of the puzzle that are make the process much easier and much more meaningful, if you ask me. So it's very, very important. As I said, I understand that data collection is sometimes an issue. Maybe it's not collected. Maybe it's in different departments. That's something that we've all had to face. Intersectional data, we've talked about this before at other meetings, is often not available, but again, I think we need to start somewhere with any data that's available, as a starting point to then build momentum, to then hopefully, be able to collect more data. The fundamental question to be asked when we're looking at the budget from a gendered perspective is about the distribution of resources, right? Who gets what? Okay. Are they distributed equally? And does it also further equity goals? Okay. Now, this sort of assumes, of course, that your institution has defined its gender equity goals. Okay, so that then they become a sort of a way to structure the budget, in a way that furthers those goals. Okay. Let's see. I just want to return to, as I just had a peek at my notes, I want to return to this issue of intersectional data just for a second here. For us, we were able to collect data on age, disability, and nationality. These would not necessarily have been our choices, but this is what was available to us. And again, I just want to come back to that point of we have to start somewhere. And I do think it makes a difference when we start to look at how resources are distributed. Are we being equitable in terms of gender? Are we being equitable in terms of disability or different abilities? I mean, I think these are the questions we need to ask of the budget. Okay. Where does the money go? And is the distribution equitable? Okay. So I had an example here from what we did. So we were able to get a certain amount of the budget. We weren't able to get the entire budget. And the way it was presented to us was in percentages, not in actual numbers. That was what we could get. I'm just being quite frank about it. So one of the things that we looked at that we thought was important to look at was the distribution of scholarships. So who is getting financially supported? And my point here in presenting this graph is to try to show how important it is to look at both how the scholarships are awarded in terms of who gets what percentage-wise, but also how does that compare to the percentage of the population. So we looked at, and let me also just say that when it comes to data, we are in Turkey, and officially we have two sexes. We don't even have gender, really, to be honest. I mean, I think one of the issues that we are all struggling with, certainly we are struggling with, is the fact that so much of this process is trapped in the gender binary. Okay? I just want to acknowledge that, and then moving on from there. So you can see that for undergraduate scholarships, 40% go to men, 60% go to women. Doesn't look like we have an issue there. But I think it's important also to look at the fact that 43% of our undergraduates are men and 56% are women. So again, I think we need to be looking at both the distribution of the resource, but also when it comes to something like scholarship, what's the percentage of the population? Okay. MA scholarships, 41% to men, 59% to women. Again, women slightly, you might argue, overrepresented, or we have parity. We also, you can see in the next column, we have parity among students as well. And the same story continues on through PhD and the number of PhD students, so that we have, well, more than parity, if you will. 60% overall of scholarships go to women, but 40% go to men. Now, I think if you were to just look at scholarships and the fact that 60% go to women and 40% go to men, some people would say, oh, look, women are overrepresented. All right. But if you look at the percentage of the population, that disaggregated data again, alongside how the resource is distributed, the story makes more sense. Women are almost 60% at every level of the
Yeah,
student
because of the
population.
necessities.
So it makes sense that they would be getting 60% of the scholarships. Okay, so that was scholarship. You can also see that scholarships is a tiny percentage of our budget. Now, I think this is probably the graph maybe that would interest a lot of people. Salaries at our institution represent 2/3 of the university's budget. So this is a really important, um, part of the budget to look at. And again, so if we look at the total, women get 53% of the total salary budget, men get 47. All right. If we look at academic personnel, the numbers closely line up with how they are represented in the total, a little bit less for women. Um, and if we look at administrative personnel, also I think quite important. Here the story switches. 58% of the administrative salaries go to men, and 42% go to women. So, for example, this may be a place that there is a need for some adjustment, or at least I would say here for further analysis about why is 58% of the salaries for administrative personnel going to men when they are only 51% of the administrative personnel. Okay. May not be a huge difference, but we are talking about salaries after all. So this is one of those places where I think it behooves us to start asking the question about why are the resources distributed this way? And is there a problem? Is there one or two people who are an outlier here who are driving the number up? Or again, I just think there needs to be further analysis here to really tell us the story. But I think these are the kinds of situations that we're looking for to, again, ask that question, why is it this way? And is this an issue of inequality? It might not be, but again, that's the place to start. Is there inequality? And then let's try to show that there is or is not. And if there is inequality, of course, how are we going to rectify that? Um, I remembered that I think the example goes with the next page, if I remember. Yeah, okay. So there are two basic approaches to gender budgeting, I think. One is the ideal, the fully integrated budgeting process. The entire budget for an institution is analyzed using a gender perspective, not just salaries, but physical infrastructure, laboratories, dorms, sports facilities, health facilities, whatever kind of facilities there are, scholarships, consumables, subcontracting and procurement. I mean, the entire institutional budget is gone over precisely from a gender perspective who is getting what and is there inequality. Okay? Determine the gender gaps, determine the inequities. Okay? And then in the creation of a new budget to try to rectify any inequities. Okay? To try to ensure that those inequities are not happening. Now, I have two little examples that have nothing to do with salaries for a change. Um, I think lots of times we get really focused on salary. It is often the place where there is the largest gender inequity. I think that that's definitely the case, but it's not the only place. So I guess my advice would be let's not get stuck there. So I'm sure many of you have seen the film, the documentary Picture a Scientist. And if you haven't, please, it's a terrific documentary. Um, in the film, Dr. Nancy Hopkins, a very well-known biologist in the United States at MIT, uh, was part of the group of people who wrote sort of the first institutional assessment about gender at MIT in the 1980s. And Dr. Hopkins knew from her own experience that she was receiving less laboratory space than the men. She had gone, she had asked for more laboratory space. They had said there isn't enough. We can't give it to you, so on and so forth. I'm sure this is an excuse we've all heard. So she took it upon herself and she went out and she measured all of the laboratory space at MIT. And of course, demonstrated that men were awarded much more and much larger laboratory space on average than women. So I think that it's important to think about our physical infrastructure as well. Um, our institution, Kadir Has University, is a lovely historic building, sits right on the Golden Horn. One side of the building faces the water. It's beautiful, ships, sometimes dolphins. All of the offices that face the water are occupied by men, regardless of rank. I mean, it doesn't matter what rank. It's not about rank. It's not all the professorial men, full professor men, but all those offices are occupied by men, which I think is interesting. It's not a lottery. It's not, there's no equitable division there. Somehow they happen to all occupy those lovely sea view offices. So as I said, the first gender budgeting approach, the ideal gender budgeting approach, full integration throughout the entire process. Okay. Use a gender perspective to analyze the budget, then recreate a new budget which addresses, to the extent possible, inequities and gender gaps. Of course, an inclusive gender budgeting process. Also, the process, I think, it's important to be inclusive there. So that's one way to do it. I think the ideal way to do it, but not always possible. I'm just frank about it. Another aspect is to create a budget that goes with the gender equality plan for targeted gender equality activities. This was our approach because it made sense for our situation. And I think it's something that I see a lot of institutions do, frankly. I think it's easier, and it makes sense in that regard. Although I think it's less satisfying, obviously, than a fully integrated gender process. So I just took a page from our gender equality plan just to give you an idea of how we did it. There's no science here. Let me just be frank about it. So obviously, I mean, maybe the format looks familiar. Obviously, we identified a problem. We came up with a planned action, who's responsible, how we're going to measure the success. We tried to tie it to sustainability goals. And then literally we added a column and we tried to add what we thought was the adequate budget necessary to attain that. Because I think what so many of us know, but many people forget, is that gender equality costs money. I mean, there's a cost here, whether it's people's labor, mostly it's labor. And it's often thought to be a volunteer activity. And I don't think that, that's appropriate. So as you can see, we created some numbers that we thought were reasonable to try to implement that activity. Because, as is often the case, despite the fact that the EU, well, they don't just remind us, but the one of the five requirements for gender equality plans is dedicated resources. And I think it's certainly in Turkey. I mean, we've looked at most of the university's plans. Certainly in Turkey, it is one of the least fulfilled obligations that there are no dedicated resources. So there's certainly no gender budget, and there's no resources even for the people who create the gender equality plan. So while perhaps a less than ideal approach, it is a place to start to try to recognize the fact that gender equality initiatives have revenue, or have budgetary implications. Okay. So I didn't want to ignore the municipalities that we have been working with. And mostly also, I bring the municipalities in here as a reminder that gender budgeting can be done at any institution, but every institution has its own constraints, its own culture, its own way of doing things. And so, I mean, a gender budget will look maybe very different, which is why I've tried to sort of talk about the philosophy, the motivation, and some ways that we have done it. Because again, I think even at two universities, it could be very different. Depending on the way the university is organized, is it public, private, so on and so forth. And I think that comes back to municipalities. Of course, municipalities serve two major constituents. They have their own staff and their own employees, but they also have citizens and they have budget for both. So this was in our project, this is one issue that we spent a long time talking about with the municipalities, which is who is the gender budget for? Is it for the staff and the employees, or is it also for the citizens? Should there be two? Is there one? And long discussions, but the issue here is that any kind of gender budget needs to fit whatever institution you're at. I mean, it has to become, I think, a part of the culture of that institution. And so it has to adhere to whatever that institutional culture is to a certain degree. Okay. I think it's largely true for universities as well. Who's the focus of the gender budget? I mean, oftentimes when we look at gender equality plans, they focus on academic staff. They often don't have as much focus on administrative staff, and they have even less focus on students. So I think one of the issues is to decide who is, I mean, who is the gender equality plan for? That's one question. But who is the budget for as well? Who does the budget cover? And so if you're budgeting, then who's the constituency? I mean, I think that is a fundamental question. And of course, the issue, again, I keep coming back to the issue of disaggregated data, but I really think it's important because they go hand in hand. gender disaggregated data and gender budget. I don't think you can adequately do a gender budget unless you have gender disaggregated data, to be quite honest. And of course, many of us, more and more of us live in countries where collecting data is becoming more and more of a political issue, whether it's about recognizing gender as opposed to sex and recognizing multiple genders, let alone sexual orientation, let alone religion could be an issue, just depending on where you're at. So for us, all of these became issues, to be quite honest, the issue of collecting data. One of our municipalities was very clear with us. They said, we can collect data on the basis of sex and that's it. If we do anything else, we will not get reelected. I mean, they were very clear about their position. So again, everything has to be tailored to your institution. Okay. So I'm almost done here. Actually, this is the last slide. So the OECD has best practices for gender budgeting, seemed a good thing to include. Strengthening the link between budgeting and key gender equality objectives. Of course, this assumes that the key gender equality objectives have been identified. I mean, there's an assumption there, but it's important. Ensuring gender budgeting is sustainable. Really important. I mean, we have included, I think in our case, a very practical case, we included a gender budget on our gender equality plan because we have the Budget It project. But I do not see that as sustainable going forward. It's not something that has been integrated into the planning culture of our university yet. Okay, so sustainability always an issue. Incorporating gender budgeting into the overarching budget framework. To be honest with you, and it says with leadership from the highest authorities. I think if we think of this as another part of the gender equality puzzle, I mean, for years, those of us doing this work have been trying to encourage people to have a gender perspective on whatever they're looking at, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's who does what job, these kinds of things. And this is just another thing to add to the list, that we're encouraging people to look at budgeting and the distribution of resources from a gender perspective. Embedding gender budgeting tools at all stages of the budget cycle, super important. Underpinning gender budgeting with strong data and analysis. I think I've gone on enough about that. Supporting gender budgeting implementation through capacity building, exactly, and using gender budgeting to reinforce transparency and accountability. Exactly, I think those are really the issues. Just there's a few resources. I'll be happy to share the slides with anybody. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions. I hope, maybe just a nice discussion. Let me stop sharing. There we go. Whew.